Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining us for our latest webinar. My name is Max Kanevsky. I'm the founder of OpenCDisc and president of Clinical 21. The topic of today's webinar is the latest guidance that just got finalized from FDA, which details the requirements for submission of future data in standardized study format. We're going to cover a number of topics today. We're going to go through the guidance to make sure that we show you what impact this will have on you. We'll focus on the timelines when this needs to be implemented. We'll discuss how you should communicate with FDA during the process. And we'll finish it off with a technical discussion of what you need to do to make sure that your data is compliant with FDA requirements. We have two industry experts today as speakers. Our first presenter is DJ Chhatre. DJ has been working at FDA since 2009. He's been working as part of the eDATA team, and he's been supporting a lot of the test submissions and a lot of the questions that you've been sending the eDATA email address. That was DJ who has been involved in helping the industry comply with the standard. DJ has also been very active in the FUSE organization. He's been the industry lead for the Optimizing the Use of Data Standards Working Group, as well as the FDA lead for the Data Validation and Quality Assessment Group. And he has been a speaker, panelist, or session chairman at multiple international conferences. Our second speaker today is Sergiy Sirichenko. He is the principal data scientist here at Clinical 21. He's also a co-founder of OpenCDisc. For the last 3 years, he's also been working at FDA as a data fitness analyst for the FDA Jumpstart and the FDA eDATA teams. He's also been the primary validation rule developer for both the FDA DataFit system and OpenCDisc. And if you have ever asked a question on OpenCDisc forum, he was probably the one that answered it for you in the past couple of years. Before we begin the presentations, just a couple of points of information. If you want to follow our, to get updates about our future events or releases of newer versions of OpenCDisc, there's a number of different ways you can follow us. You can follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. We also have a blog on clinical21.net, which will have the recording of this webinar as well as the slides and the responses to the questions they receive throughout the presentation. And of course, as always, you can follow us on opencdisc.org for the latest events and information about new releases of the software. Throughout the presentation, you'll notice there is at the left top corner, there's an Ask a Question button. So please, if you have a question, please go ahead and fill it out. With 10 minutes left, we'll try to answer as many of them as we can. And whatever is left over, we'll make sure we answer them offline and post those answers on the Clinical 21 blog. Also, on the right top corner, you'll also notice full screen mode. Some people find that mode will help you see the slides a little bit better. All right, we'll go ahead and begin the presentation. I'll switch you over to DJ for the first presentation. All right, DJ.
Okay, Max, can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Perfect. So welcome, everybody. My name is DJ. As Max said, I've been at FDA. Right now I'm at Booz Allen, leading out our data standards capability. And so Max and I agreed that this was probably the best way to let everybody know. So just as a quick disclaimer, these views are mine and mine alone. They don't represent any guidance or advice from the FDA itself. So as a quick overview of what I'll be touching on in the first half of the webinar, I'll be providing some background on the guidance document, providing an overview of the 2 guidance documents that were published, as well as 2 of the technical specification documents, so the Data Standards Catalog and the Study Data Technical Conformance Guide. Sergiy is actually going to touch on a lot more of the details of that conformance guide in his talk. And the second half of my presentation is around how to interact with FDA and how to implement standardization per the FDA's view. So as a background, Section 745A of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was amended by FDASIA, and it required applications to be submitted electronically 24 months after publication of the final guidance from FDA. So FDASIA was signed in 2012. It generally expanded FDA's authority, so there was reauthorization of MDUFA and PDUFA. There was the authorization of GDUFA and BSUFA. And with all these different UFAs, there were a lot of different things going on. But the biggest takeaway, in my opinion, about data standards was that FDA now has the authority to issue guidance documents which are binding. So essentially what that means is they don't have to get to regulations in order for industry to be required to do something. And that's a huge paradigm shift from what has been in the past. So specifically, Title 11, Section 1136 addresses the electronic formats of applications. Again, it really just touches on the 24 months following issue of final guidance, and that within the guidance themselves, there should be a timetable of the standards. So to that end, the FDA published their binding guidance documents on December 17th, which required submissions be submitted electronically and contain study data in conformance with standards, specifically CDISC standards. So of the two final guidance documents, there was what I would call the parent guidance, which is just electronic format, and then the individual guidance, which specified the standardized study data. So within that individual guidance, there are four nested guidance documents. So there's the Data Standards Catalog, the Technical Conformance Guide, and then the FDA-specific SEND and SDTM validation rules. And I think what's important to note is that this is not new. The FDA has consistently pushed that standardization would only help enhance reviewability, provide more efficacious and safe products to market. In the position statement they put out in 2013, they said they didn't foresee replacing CDISC, and now we see that that was true, right? That CDISC submissions are, in fact, what FDA wants to see moving forward. So the parent guidance document was issued, and it describes how FDA is going to interpret and plan to implement Section 745AA. Specifically, what are the types to be submitted electronically and a general timetable. So again, this is a binding guidance document. It applies to all NDAs, ANDAs, BLAs, and INDs. There are a couple of exceptions. So non-commercial INDs are not included in this, and devices which are required to submit an IND to CBER as a prereq to the BLA are not included either. The key takeaway, there were two key takeaways. The first is that FDA is going to issue individual guidance documents because they felt like it was not possible to issue one large guidance document touching on everything. And so these individual guidance documents are going to specify the formats for submission and then the corresponding timetable. The second key takeaway was that, and what is perhaps most important to industry, is that submissions that are not in electronic format will not be filed. So the FDA will RTF those submissions if the data that they receive does not conform to the required standards, formats, or terminology. So the good part about this is that electronic submissions are on the rise. So from FY09 to FY13, the FDA has seen an increasing positive trend in the number of electronic submissions they receive regardless of application type. I mean, in FY13, about 80% of the NDAs that they received were in electronic format. So this shouldn't be the big change to industry. Okay? It's going to really be the individual guidance document. So the guidance document, the individual guidance document describes the requirements for electronic submission of standardized clinical and non-clinical study data. Again, this guidance is binding. It has the same application that it applies to, NDAs, ANDAs, BLAs, INDs, the same exemptions. The two main documents that really specify the formats and ways that FDA wants to receive the data. The first is that Data Standards Catalog, which lists out explicitly the formats for study data that FDA can process, review, and archive. And that's an important piece to note because the whole concept of standardization is that it improves the regulatory review process from receipt to review to storage. So the DSC includes not just the required versions, but the versions that are also supported. So as time moves on, you'll see, SDTM versions, multiple versions of a standard like SDTM will be supported, while maybe only one or two or three will be required. There are also key dates. So when does the requirement begin and end? When does that support for a version begin and end? And the biggest takeaway is that there will be no waivers for this requirement. So the e-study guidance, as FDA refers to, there's no waivers. So the only possible waiver is for a specific version of a data standard, and even that, as a sponsor, you will have to explain why in the reviewer's guide, which is a document I'll be touching on in a few slides. So with the concept of no waivers, again, a positive note in all of this is that since FY04, the FDA has received an increasing number of SDTM NDAs, so NDAs that contain SDTM studies. In addition, FDA has noted that there is a significant increase in the number of SDTM NDAs that sponsors are self-identifying. So they're seeing sponsors be more comfortable with saying to FDA that they're submitting an SDTM study. And I think that has really helped FDA push out this guidance, really start making that requirement mandatory, because the industry is looking to sort of make that next step into submitting standardized data. So the timetable at the bottom describes that implementation timeframe. So when the final guidance and catalog was published in December 17th of 2014, the timetable is as follows because it is a new requirement. NDAs, ANDAs, and BLAs will have 2 years from this 2014 date before the data standards catalog will be required for those studies. You have 3 years for an IND. So it's a 2-year, 3-year timetable. Any study that begins after December 17th of 2016 for NDA, BLAs, or ANDAs will be required to follow the data standards catalog as published today, as published on December 17th. So as a sponsor, you need to start becoming aware of that. It's not going to be perhaps an easy or quick change, whether it's an internal process or a process with your CRO. So this is something that you as a sponsor need to start thinking about and planning ahead for. So the data standards catalog itself defines the FDA-supported standards of either exchange format, study data, and control terminology. So there are these 3 sections. First, exchange format essentially just describes the manner or the way in which the information is encoded. So what is the vehicle or what is the vessel for the information itself? So for a document, we're talking about PDF. For a study data set, it's going to be in the SAS, export, XUT. Metadata, you're talking about an XML. Okay? The data itself, so the study data itself, really should describe the different data elements and the different relationships between the elements to ensure that there won't be any ambiguous exchange of information from sponsor to FDA. And those methods are obviously going to be the tabulations, SDTM or SEND, and then the analysis study data, so the ATOM. The third section is around the control terminology. So this is really referring to the vocabularies to making sure that semantic interoperability exists, the key concepts that are represented as either preferred terms or synonyms or codes. This is all part of control terminology. What is not contained in this are custom terms or custom code lists. Okay? FDA doesn't want to see that. That goes against the inherent definition of standardization. Extensible code lists are an issue. So the whole point of an extensible code list is that if something doesn't exist, you can extend it to include terms or elements that are specific to you as a sponsor. That might work, but what FDA really wants to see is if there is a code list or a terminology that needs to be extended, they want industry to go through the process. So interact with the SDO, petition to have it included in a terminology so that there's no extension, right? It becomes part of the standard code list. And that really lends itself to FDA being able to really implement data standards and standardization efforts from industry to make sure the review processes are going to be implemented more efficiently. So examples are the NDF, CDIS control terminology, MEDRA. So in the catalog itself, I think 2 key takeaways are the following. There are 2 significant and different use cases, and the timetable at the bottom describes this. So one use case, or the first use case, is around an update, a version update to an existing standard in the catalog. The second use case is a new standard being introduced. So in the first example, SDTM is listed out in the catalog. The STO in this example is CDIS. If CDIS releases a version update in, let's say, Feb of 2016, this isn't necessarily going to be a huge task for FDA to do their testing, make sure systems and tools are in place that can handle it. Okay? So later in that year, maybe in May of 2016, FDA will update the catalog and then issue an FR notice. Within the FR notice, there will be a transition date, and the transition date will always be March 15th. The year is what will be dictated by when the FR notice gets put out. So in this example, because the FR notice was done after March of 2016, the transition date will be the following year. So it will be March 15, 2017. Industry then has 12 months from the transition date until this requirement actually begins. So you would then have to be required to implement SCTM 4.1 on March 15, 2018. So it's a very short time frame from when an update gets released to when the requirement begins. A new standard is a little bit different, and it's a much longer process. So as an example, let's say a new standard comes out from around data exchange format. So if an SDO, whichever SDO it is, releases a new standard in, let's say, Feb of 2017, this might take the FDA a little bit longer to make sure that the standard itself works. So it might take until April of 2018 until FDA feels confident that they can handle this new exchange format. So they'll, again, go through the similar process. They'll update their catalog, they'll issue the FR notice, and within the FR notice will be the explicit transition date. Again, in this example, because the FR notice was after March, the transition date will be the following year's March 15. So we're looking at a transition date of March 15, 2019. The requirements are going to be different from a version update, but similar to the current initial timetable. So you would again have 2 years for NDAs, BLAs, and ANDAs, and 3 years for INDs until the requirement holds. So you're looking at 2021 or 2022, depending on the application type. So the whole point of this timetable is to make sure that industry and individual sponsors are made aware that sorry about that, I got disconnected. Max, can you see us again?
Let's see your slide.
Okay. So the whole point is that you need to plan ahead for the future and the future requirements and be really on top of what SDOs are releasing, what standards and what versions. Because if you know the version update comes out now, you know, generally speaking, when you're going to be required to implement, depending on if it's an update or a new standard. So the next 2 slides touch a little bit, and there's a lot of text, I know. It just touches a little bit on the technical conformance guide. And this is a non-binding guidance. It provides really just the specifications, recommendations, and considerations for industry and how to submit standardized data using the data standards from the DSC. It's not binding, but it's very helpful to FDA if industry follows these considerations. A lot of these should look similar to what you have seen in other documents, and that's because this guide really supersedes the study data specifications and the common issues document. So a lot of these things you might have seen in one of those 2. I'm not going to touch on this. The decks will be made available on the blog, as Max said, so when they are made available, please take a look and read them. There's a lot of important information, albeit similar to what you might have already seen. The key takeaway here, and Sergey is going to touch on it a lot more detail, is that there are different sections, there are different formats. The thing that I wanted to point out was specifically the therapeutic area standards. And it's important because it's blank in the technical conformance guide, and yet the section exists. And I think it's extremely telling for what is to come in the what I would consider short-term future, in that it was important enough to include, and it will be important enough that FDA wants industry to be made aware that this is coming, right? Therapeutic area standards, some of them have already been published. Others are in the process. So FDA is actively working with CDISC, actively getting the requirements from their reviewers for specific therapeutic areas. There are therapeutic areas that they're going to look into in the future. So look up these therapeutic areas that are relevant to you as an organization. Understand the implementation guides, test them, use them. If you have questions, ask CDISC, ask the FDA. This is one of the most important pieces to me of the guide because there was nothing there. So moving a little bit differently, we're going to be talking about now the methods to interact with the FDA. So a lot of this should look similar to you as an organization. So the agency has provided sponsors with sponsor FDA meetings, as well as email access to FDA's technical SMEs to discuss your data standardization plan. And so the image really just describes at a high level the regulatory review process, right? So it begins with you as an organization developing an SOP, doing the EDCs, doing your clinical trials, having some of these standardized meetings with FDA, and then you submit your NDA, okay? FDA wants you to use these established meetings, so for example, the pre-IND, the end of phase 2, to discuss your data standardization plan, to raise any issues you have with data standards, the standardization process. They don't want it done at the pre-NDA meeting. To them, that's considered too late to begin that discussion because it's going to be extremely difficult for you as the sponsor to make any changes that FDA suggests. So what they really want is to begin this discussion at the pre-IND. You also have at your disposal a Type C meeting. So Type Cs you can use for specific topics. So if you want to discuss any issues with your data standardization process, request a Type C meeting. Have the right folks present to discuss whatever issues you're having. So the example I gave is a happy one, it's a positive one from an FDA perspective, where you have a sponsor that wants to use a standard not currently listed in the DSC. So for example, you're very proactive, which FDA loves, and you want to implement one of the therapeutic area standards. FDA is excited. I mean, this is a Type C meeting that they're going to love to have with you because it not only shows that you're doing data standardization, which makes their job easier, but it also gives them a preview of what to expect when the actual application gets received. And it gives them a little bit of head start in terms of knowing what to expect, providing their views and opinions on the data and the process to help you, before you even submit your application. The third opportunity you have is to submit sample data for technical review prior to submission of your actual application. So this is essentially a sponsor's ability to request FDA validate their data, whether it's SDTM, ATOM, SEND, and FDA will do that. In CEDAR, the eDATA team looks at these. So they will validate it, provide you a report, identify areas that need explanations if an error exists or too many warnings exist. And those are items that you either would resolve yourself or through a CRO or explain in your reviewer's guide, which we'll touch on next. But it allows you to get a precursor, almost a jump start to FDA's jump start process. Right? It makes sure that you understand what FDA's expectations are of the standardized data specific to your submission. And then the fourth opportunity is really email, and that goes from the very beginning of you're just developing your EDC and CRS, hopefully using CDASH, all the way to submission of your application. And you have access to CEDAR SMEs, you have access to CEDAR SMEs. I've listed the email addresses for both on the slide. Contact them. I mean, there's a lot of very technical and savvy folks that read the requests or questions or concerns that come into these mailboxes. Some of these questions are very complicated, so it might take longer for them to respond, but they will respond, and that's an important piece to note is that sometimes there has to be a group meeting to discuss the question, and oftentimes that leads to either FDA reaching out to the SDO or modifying something that they themselves have put out, either in the Conformity guide or presentation, and making sure that everybody is aware and in agreement of what the process should be. In addition to these meetings and email communication, the FDA also recommends submission of what I call supplemental documents. And these documents describe the submission of your data and any special considerations or directions that will help facilitate their review process. So there are three major documents. There's the Study Data Standardization Plan, or the SDSP, which really just describes the plan of how you're going to submit standardized data, identifying any potential issues, what studies, what standards, what formats and versions. If you're not using a format or standard that's in the DSC, explaining it. That's generally the overall plan. Then there's the two guides, so the reviewer's guides, one for study data, one for analysis data. And those guides really are describing study, special considerations or directions on how to look at the data or understand the relationships between either the data or the report and the data itself, or explaining the context behind an analysis that will supplement your defined.xml. two major benefits to you as industry. FDA has already listed explicitly what they want to see in these guides, in these documents. Okay? On top of that, building on top of that, Fuse has several working groups. As Max mentioned, I'm actually leading out one of the working groups, optimizing the use of data standards. There are multiple teams which are made up of volunteers from industry as well as a few reps from FDA that are working on these as a joint effort, coming up with templates that everyone in industry can use. So the big benefit to you is that for the reviewer's guide, Fuse working groups have already developed templates. And the templates include not just how to complete the template for the guideline, the template itself, but also examples. So if this is your first time doing a submission and you want to submit standardized data, these templates will help you get that information in the guide to the FDA as FDA would like to see it. For the data standardization plan, there's a team right now working on generating a draft SDSD template. The conference, there's a Fuse conference in March if you're interested in the DC area. So there will be discussions on that template. If you're interested in either learning how to join and help volunteer, again, these are all volunteers. They're not getting paid. It's just people understanding the greater good, right? It's not just financials for an organization. It's getting safe products to the patient. So if you're interested in joining in any capacity, please reach out. If you want to learn more about the requirements or how to better communicate with FDA or CROs, my email is provided here. I'm more than happy to help or talk about it. So that's the end of my discussion, and then Sergey is going to talk more about the conformance guide.
Thank you, DJ. Now we'll go ahead and switch to a technical review of the FDA requirements.
Hello, everybody. This presentation is a short overview of FDA Study Data Conformance Guide with the focus on sorry, we have some technical issues with connection. Okay, we're back. Sorry for inconvenience. So this presentation is a quick overview of FDA Study Technical Conformance Guide with a focus on details which are important or new since the draft release of this document almost a year ago. We'll also give you some examples of common issues we observed in submission data. FDA defines the purpose of this guide as to provide technical recommendations to the sponsor. And the guide is intended to complement and promote interactions between sponsors and FDA. However, it's not intended to replace the need for sponsors to communicate directly with the review division. And you will see during this presentation that we'll emphasize that communication with the review division is very, very important. Section 3 of the document is about exchange format, and it's XML for CTD and define XML. PDF format should be used for documents, and supported versions of define XML you can find in standard catalog webpage. File transport format is still used in SAS export version 5. Please do not confuse with SAS seaport. This guidance specifies that it should be one dataset per file, and dataset name should be the same as the name of XPT file. For example, AE domain should have AE.xpt, and this is quite common issue in non-standardized data like pharmacokinetics or pharmacogenomics, which is usually outside of STRM CDISC data form. Please ensure that your teams, PK teams and PG teams are aware of this. Dataset size should be less than 1 gigabyte. If it's more than 1 gigabyte, it should be split into smaller files. You need to submit both non-split and split data sets. There is some special split folder. You can find details on section 7, and there are a couple technical details which are not clear here. For example, how to handle define XML file for 2 folders. Dataset variable length should be resized to the maximum length of the actual values, and variable names and labels should follow SAS limitations. The same is true about variable. There are some additional requirements on that. You should use only ASCII text codes. There is no punctuation, dashes, spaces, on other non-alphabetical symbols are expected in dataset names. Labels may have punctuation characters, but there are some additional requirements like no unbalanced apostrophe, quotation marks, parentheses, breaks, braces, brackets. More than and less signs are not also acceptable in labels, and this is an example you can see here with unbalanced apostrophe. Section 4 is dedicated to study data submission format. FDA emphasize that foundational standards are SDISC standards. Standards catalog provides a listing of supported data standards and versions. Analysis files are critical for review process. ADAM is expected for STRM data, and currently there are no ADAM specifications developed for SAM data. BAM implementation guides do not provide specific instructions in certain study data. Sponsors should discuss their proposed approach with review division. They recommend to implement STRM standards prior to the conduct of the study, and the usage of standards during the data collection design, like C- can simplify that data mapping process. If there is any uncertainty about implementation, sponsors should discuss application-specific questions with the review division. There are no data imputations in STRM data. All data imputations should be present only in analysis data sets, and all relevant supported implementations is expected. And also, sponsors should not populate any numerically coded variables in STRM data sets. Subject ID. It's ID of the entity, for example, person in the trial. If the same subject is screened more than once, then subject ID should be different. There are questions about implementation of this. Either you should have one record in the demographics domain or multiple records. And again, there are no clarifications on that subject in this document. CDISC has a special working group who is working on this subject. Unique subject ID should be unique across the entire application, and the same unique subject ID should use across all data sets. And common issues we again observe in submission data that some non-standardized data sets like pharmacokinetics may have different subject ID value or even do not have unique subject ID variable. Don't expect to have any leading or trailing spaces in the value of unique subject ID because all those space characters are considered as a part of the value. It should be not inconsistency in usage of zeros, and you can see an example here. Keep in mind that improper implementation of unique subject ID may result in request for sponsor to fix and resubmit their data. It's one of the highest and biggest potential violation in submission data. Adjudication data. There are no existing standards or best practice, and FDA advises sponsors to discuss their approach with the review division, include details in study data reviewer guide on presence, implementation approach, and location of adjudication data. Subqual domains should be used only for key variables which does not fit STDM domains. Examples we have seen in submission data include subquals domains which keep all EDC or raw variables in addition to STDM variables. Some submissions have more than 300 subqual variables which contain all possible data management information, a lot of redundant information. Please keep in mind that only key variables which are used for analysis and review should be present in subqual domains. And discuss your approach with the review division, and we need to document everything in SDRG. Demographics domain should have single record per subject, and subject means subject ID variable. ARM is blank for screen feathers, and actual ARM should be blank for not treated subject. This FDA request is inconsistent with CDISC implementation guide examples, and as you all remember, ARM and ARMS and actual ARM variables are required variables. So some clarifications on this statement is expected. Disposition domain should have epoch variable value populated for all records. And again, this is inconsistency with STDM implementation guide. This is what FDA wants to have. That record should be the last subject record in the dataset. Subject elements domain should be included. Adverse events treatment emergent flag is expected. All adverse events which are collected on CRF's form should be included in the submission data, regardless of their treatment emergent status. And seriousness criteria for adverse events should be provided. This information is very critical for review. In case of custom domains, sponsors need to confirm that there are no standard domains. Please check recent versions of implementation guide and provide details in study data review guide. Large size is a common issue in lab domain, and FDA asks to split data into files less than 1 gigabyte according to LB category and LB subcategory if needed, not by unique subject ID or just by file size, using that approach only. Trial design domains should be included in submission data. analysis data model. FDA said that ADAM analysis data sets facilitate review process. However, in some cases, it does not always provide data structure in the way that supports all the analysis. There are some examples here. So in such cases, a sponsor should, as needed, supplement their ADAM data sets after discussion with a specific review division. Key variables and key efficacy and safety variables domains are expected, and detailed documentation is required. In addition to protocol schedule visits variables like visit and visit number, at least 2 additional timing variables are expected, analysis visit and analysis visit number, that can help to handle visit windows in analysis data. 4 variables should be listed after the key variables. Dates and analysis data sets should be numeric. In addition to ISO 8601 variables, imputation partially missing dates are allowed. Flag variables should be provided, and a documentation on your imputation algorithms are required. All labels and analysis data sets should be unique and different from STDM. And this example, when adverse event is not correct label for ADAE. Software programs. FDA asks sponsor to provide programs used to create ADAM data sets and table figures and listings in ASCII text or PDF format. And also they recommend to use names with the reference to software, like you can see example in the slide. And sufficient documentation for provided programs are then required. Analysis data subject level data set is required. Important study specific baseline subject characteristics and covariates are presented in protocol should be included. And again, if there is any imputed data, it should be submitted in analysis data sets, and all detailed and relevant supporting documentation should be provided in defined XML file, in analysis data review guide, or any other additional documents like complicated algorithms, supplemental documentations. All those documents are welcome. There is a special section dedicated to SANT. It's similar to STDM, and there are few SANT-specific issues are discussed here, like result modifiers for MI domain or tumor XPT file, which is required for oncology studies. FDA said that variables which are collected and any variables that are needed to compute derivations should be submitted. And again, STDM dataset should not contain imputed data. However, there are certain STDM operationally derived variables which are expected by FDA. And FDA emphasized that if the data needed to derive these variables are missing, then these variables cannot be derived, and the value should be null. So we have seen in submission data when sponsors populate study days or partially missing days. So you cannot do it in STDM data. And these slides represent examples of FDA expected variables. It's a baseline flat variables in LB, ES, G, C, and MD domains. In general, if data were collected or can be derived, then baseline flag should be populated. Epoch variable, and again, you need to populate these variables if they are applicable. For example, like in medical history, you expect to have records only with epoch as screener. Probably in this case, you can skip and do not include epoch variable in medical history domain. Study days also should be populated every time when a relevant study dates variable were collected. Define XML file, the data definition file. A properly functioning defined XML file is an important part of the submission of electronic study data sets. Defined PDF is also expected for defined XML version 1.0. FDA recommends to send test files to FDA eDATA team prior to submission to identify any potential problems with your metadata. And FDA emphasized that insufficiently documented defined file is a common deficiency in submission data. I also can confirm this from my personal experience. I would say that in most of submissions, provided metadata is very poor quality. Style sheets files for defined XML are required. Annotated case reports form. Again, introduce new name acrf.pdf instead of blank crfs. PDF mapping of each field in CRF to dataset variable is expected. Annotated CRF should include both variable names and coding for each CRF item. If some data are recorded on CRF but not submitted, you need to annotate this with not submitted text and explain why in reviewer's guide. Section 5 is dedicated to therapeutic area standards. It is empty now. It's reserved for future comments. Section 6 is terminology. Common dictionaries should be used across all clinical studies and throughout the submission for each of the following: adverse events, concomitant medication, procedures, medical history, indications, and study drug names. Please see standards catalog for recommended usage of terminology. Conformance with standard terminology is required, and common issues with terminology is misspelling of standard terms, not following upper and lower case, or use of hyphens. FDA recommends to use the most current version of FDA-supported terminology available at the time of the coding. We have seen just recent submissions which use Migrate version 9. Different studies may use different versions. Impact on usage of all versions should be described in the reviewer's guide and standardization plan. And any pool analysis like ISS must use a single version of terminology. So recording your terminology may be needed. FDA recommend to use so-called good terminology management practice across the whole organization and across all applications. Creation of new custom terms is discouraged, and DG provided some good explanations about misusage of CD's so-called extensible control terminology. Consistency through the application is expected, and you need to discuss your standardization plan with FDA and then document everything in the reviewer's guide. Adverse events should use MEDRA dictionary. You need to follow exact spelling and capitalization of original terms. There are still some sponsors who converted original terms into uppercase. Please do not do it. And single version is expected for SS. For medication, there is a special FDA unique ingredient identifier dictionary, which is used in trial summary domain for different treatment parameters. Food drug dictionary should be used for concomitant medication. FDA recommends to use a generic name term for decoded variable, and class variable should be populated with class term if it's a single class for the drug or ATS, ATC level 4 otherwise. All ATC codes should be provided in subfloor domain. Pharmacology class should use special National Drug File Reference Terminology Dictionary in trial summary domain. For indication, you need to use normal control terminology. It's used in ground summary domain, and harmonization with structured problem labeling is expected. Section 7 is electronic submission format. It's CTD, define XML and supportive style sheets of the same folder. Should be in the same folder as the data sets. You should not submit any empty folders. FDA introduced new miscellaneous folder instead of listings. And for need of additional folders in your study data, in your study, you need to consult with FDA. Section 8 is a data validation and traceability. FDA defined data validation as a process that attempts to ensure that submitted data are both compliant and useful. Compliant means that the data conform to the applicable and required data standards. Useful means that the data support the intended use. For example, regulatory review and analysis. Study data validation consists of conformance validation and quality checks. You can find links to FDA business rules on standards webpage, and OpenCDs provide you executable version of these rules. FDA asks sponsors to fix issues and explain in reviewer guide why certain errors could not be corrected. So, and the last section of this document is dedicated to study data traceability, which is an important component of regulatory review, and its relationship between analysis results, analysis data sets, tabulation data sets, and source data. FDA encouraged to use standards like C-, which is very helpful to provide all this traceability. And the document discusses traceability issues with legacy data conversion. We're moving to the questions.
Thank you, Sergey. We have quite a few questions. We'll try to go through as many of them as possible. Let's go with the first one. This seems to be the most popular one. This one is for DJ. Can you clarify the timeline around when would standardized data be required? Specifically, people are asking if they have studies they have completed prior to 2015, but they're doing submission in 2017. Do they have to convert those to CDISC standard or not?
Okay, so the way that the requirement works is any study that begins after December, again, for an NDA, any study that begins after December 17, 2016 will be required to follow the DSC. So if you have studies, what will eventually happen is you will have studies that are before that December 2016 date and then after that December 2016 date. So if you have it before, you're not required to either convert it, have it in standardized format. There's no requirement for you, although the FDA will say that they prefer it. What happens is after that date, any studies that begin after those two dates will be required.
All right. The next question, let's take this one for Sergey. What other domains besides disposition requires EPOC?
I think FDA said it very clearly several years ago in CDER Common Data Issues document. FDA asked sponsors to populate EPOC in all domains when it can be populated or can provide some information. So adverse events, lab, vital signs, and in most domains you need to populate EPOC variable. You need to explain in your guide why you didn't populate EPOC variable in some domains. Because EPOC variable can facilitate the review process. It allows reviewers select records which are dedicated to a particular treatment period. It's a very useful variable, very information for review process, and it's a way for the sponsor to communicate with reviewers.
Speaking of the CDER data common issues document, the next question, and we'll take this one from DJ. The question is about, since the technical conformance guidance has supersedes the CDER common data issues document, what happens to the requirements that were in the CDER document that is no longer in the technical conformance guide? And one example that is being used is regarding the reference start date. The CDER guide said that there was 2 cases in which you did not have to populate them, but that example was removed from the technical conformance guide.
Sure. So the way that the transition will happen is going to be phased. It's going to be a timed approach. So there are going to be items that are added into the conformance guide that were existing in the study data specs or the common issues document. And then there are going to be things that were removed from those 2 documents that you're not going to find in the conformance guide. So the process is going to be the following. You need to explain either why you are following or not following the technical conformance guide. So again, the guide is not required, right? So it doesn't get required until 2016 end or 2017 end, depending on the application type. So what FDA wants to see is, while they prefer you follow these guides, they want you to explain why you are not adhering to one or more of the issues or one of the standards. So if there's something that you want to explain, it's a legitimate reason to say, we followed the common issues document version X, and based off of that version, we have done it in this way. And that's a reasonable explanation, and FDA will understand that and accept that. So as long as you explain the logic and reasoning behind what you do, as long as that makes sense, I think FDA will accept that.
One thing to also keep in mind is that these questions are not just used sort of as a requirement. They actually were created as part of the Jumpstart process, which tries to take advantage of standardized data, to create some efficiencies, like, for example, creating standard review and analysis tools. So it's not just about meeting a standard. It's really about making sure that your data could be used efficiently with the reviewers. So the next question, and this seems to be a popular one as well, is how to handle rescreen patients. Especially about how do you specify unique subject IDs and subject IDs and demographics. And let's take it to Sergey.
Unfortunately, there is no standard or good practice at this moment from FDA. The only formal requirement from FDA is to have a unique subject ID value for each rescreen subject. So when the subject entered when the subject was rescreened twice in the study, you need to have 2 entities with 2 different subject ID value. It can be done in several ways. You can have 2 separate records in subqual in a demographics domain, or you may have 1 record in demographics domain with details for another rescreen event in all domains. My personal preference is to have 2 separate records in demographics domain with 2 different subject ID and the same unique subject ID. But again, there is
So sorry, Sergey, I was just going to add to that. So this is a hot topic. So there is a working group that's putting a white paper together. So it's a FUSE working group around this very question. So, the subject ID, use subject ID, rescreens, what do you do? That will be coming out soon. It's under review right now. So that will be something that's going to be displayed and given out at the FUSE conference. So keep an eye out for it on the wiki, the FUSE wiki. The white paper itself has been reviewed by FUSE board as well as FDA folks. So it will hopefully shed a lot more light and be a little bit more of a guide for everyone with FDA's blessings.
But as I said, there is a lot of unclarity about implementation at this point. There are several working groups use, and also CDISC has their own working group. And the only formal requirement is to have separate subject ID values for each event.
All right, the next question is about the study data standardization plan. Is this a document that has to be included in the ECTT file folder structure? And if it is, where? This question is for DJ.
So that's a good question. I would send an email to the eDATA team because I think right now it's a little unclear as to where FDA wants you to submit it and where they want you to place it. And unfortunately, there's no good answer right now because there really hasn't been much guidance as to where it should be. I would, however, include it as a handout at a pre-IND meeting or a Type C meeting so that the FDA folks have it. And you can either ask before or during that meeting where it should be included in your application. But right now it's a little bit tricky, and so we're actually working to find out where that should be. So hopefully we'll have some answers for you either in the write-up or in the future.
All right. The next question is about trial design domains, and we'll have Sergiy answer it. So the question is, are trial design domains required or optional?
As I mentioned in this presentation, there are additional documents, and one of them is FDA STDM business rules. And you can find that they said that all those trial summary domains in the submission data. And well, if you don't include trial summary domain, it's an error. If you don't include other domains, it's warning. So you definitely must include trial summary because it can give information about the study, and it's used by journals. And trial summary, other trial summary domains will be very helpful for a review process as well.
Great. All right, we'll go ahead and we'll do one more question due to the time, but we will go ahead and answer all the questions that you have posted on our blog by sometime next week. So the last question, and I'll take this one. This is about what do we do if there's inconsistencies or discrepancies between the guidance, the FDA validation rules that have been published a few weeks ago, and the rules that I find in Open CDISC Validator? So this is a really good question. So obviously, because all these documents are prepared at different time, there is a potential for discrepancies. So if you find a discrepancy between the guidance, or if you have any issues or questions about the guidance or the FDA validation rule, you should post those questions to the eDATA team. If you find discrepancies between the FDA documents and what you see in Open CDISC Validator, you can post those questions to Open CDISC, the Open CDISC forum, or the Open CDISC contact page. But what we can promise you is that any kind of discrepancies will be looked at very promptly, and whether there'll be updates. I know that the FDA validation rules, those are going to be updated fairly periodically, every 3 to 6 months. And Open CDISC Validator is going to be updated on the every 3-month schedule. So hopefully those will be resolved fairly quickly, and there's going to be a very consistent set of documentation and validation rules available very shortly. So with that last question, let me first thank both speakers. Thank you so much for your time and for the valuable information you provided to the industry. And I'd like to thank all of our attendees for joining us and taking an hour of your day. Thank you very much, and we're looking forward to doing this more in the future. Thank you.